I had hoped to get through 3 sections in this video, but as they say, family-friendly version, hope in one hand, defecate in the other, which hand fills up first. There's so much science to talk about here. None of it Peterson's. Grid cells, mirror neurons, groupthink. I may have fallen down a couple rabbit holes. Aim for 3 sections, get through 1. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and other patrons like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Cass. I have a cognitive psychology PhD, and that's one of the experimental branches of psychology, and I decided to go through Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos to look at the arguments and science behind it. And in these videos, I use a visual shorthand. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This is for my response to what's in the book. And this is for looking into Peterson's references or bringing in other relevant research. Alrighty, on to why we should actively listen to people. At least that's what the chapter title says. We left off last time at the beginning of this section because I wanted to wrap up the client story that had been the bulk of the first section. And in that section, the client shared a very bad experience with Peterson, and by the end, he decided just to listen, not really weigh in one way or another on this experience. And by the time she had to stop seeing him, he was content that she was leaving less vague than when they'd started, and he seemed kind of proud that she wasn't the living embodiment of his damned ideology.
The people I listen to need to talk, because that's how people think. People need to think. Otherwise, they wander blindly into pits. When people think, they simulate the world and plan how to act in it. If they do a good job of simulating, they can figure out what stupid things they shouldn't do. Then they cannot do them. Then they don't have to suffer the consequences. That's the purpose of thinking. But we can't do it alone.
People think by talking? This cognitive psychologist says that's a broad oversimplification. Some thinking can happen when you're bouncing ideas off of other people, which is sort of along the lines of what Peterson's talking about here, I guess. But a lot of thinking, most thinking, is an internal process. And there is a potential pedantic hole to fall into here with thinking being equivocated to simulating the world. Thankfully, there's context for his intended meaning of simulate, so I can say that it's not categorically the case. So now, people need to think. I guess this counts as an opportune time then? Of course, his emphasis would be on avoiding the negative consequences of actions. It can never be for a good outcome or some form of reinforcement. Nope, just avoiding punishment. We went into more depth on this in the Raising Children chapter, but the short version is that reinforcing wanted behaviors is more effective as a parenting or pet discipline strategy than punishing undesired behaviors. It's like his version of cognitive psychology is just all the different ways we can avoid punishment. Memory, to remember bad thing happening in the past so we don't do it again in the future. Problem solving, to avoid punishment. Language, to avoid punishment. Attention, to avoid punishment. Those last 2 were meant as jokes, but those were parts of arguments in this book, so I might be onto something.
We simulate the world and plan our actions in it. Only human beings do this. That's how brilliant we are. We make little avatars of ourselves. We place those avatars in fictional worlds. Then we watch what happens. If our avatar thrives, then we act like he does in the real world. Then we thrive, we hope. If our avatar fails, we don't go there, if we have any sense. We let him die in the fictional world so that we don't have to really die in the present.
I've said this every time this argument's come up, but where is the reference supporting this idea that we're so special in this? Granted, getting null results published is a very difficult task, and that's what would have to happen here. Some sort of experiment demonstrating that animals can't simulate the world. However, birds, or at least some species of birds, are pretty good little problem solvers. So on an abstract level, We're not unique in being able to figure out complex problems. On a more concrete level, let's talk about the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a subcortical brain structure that's important for learning and memory, and its buddy out in the cortex is the medial temporal lobe, which is also really important for memory. One of the things the hippocampus does is represent the physical layout of the environment in a spatial code. The video I've got playing is a rat in an unfamiliar environment. Yeah, it's a small square, but it's new to the rat. You'll note the rat has a couple things going on. One is a reflective dot on its head to make tracking the location of its head easier in later analysis of the video. The other is the wiring attached to it. The wires are actually connected to the rat's brain, specifically its medial entorhinal cortex, which is the primary interface between the hippocampus and the cortex. The researchers are recording activity in that area. I want to clarify that when I say area, I mean they're measuring activity in a two-dimensional area of the rat's brain. Think square. So we're talking a population of cells with the spatial organization of those cells encoded by the researchers. So what you're seeing in this video is the overlay of firing activity in that medial entorhinal cortex area onto where the rat was in physical space. This work basically demonstrated how spatial location is represented in the brain, and the researchers were awarded a Nobel Prize for their efforts. Bringing this back to what Peterson was talking about, I would argue that this neural spatial representation, found in animals like rats all the way up to humans, suggests that this avatar process is part of how we represent the world, or at least our place in it. And if non-humans have this spatial encoding, it stands to reason that other cognitive processing and representation could happen with that information. The final piece I want to talk about are mirror neurons. And these are neurons that are active when an organism is doing actions, or when that organism observes another organism doing actions. So far, mirror neurons have been found in primates as well as birds, but the exact purpose of these little guys isn't really understood yet. One thought is that these can help in learning by essentially outsourcing practice. So instead of having to do the action yourself, you can watch another organism do that action, and your brain sort of practices and saves you the time of doing it. I bring up mirror neurons because the presence of these in non-human animals would suggest that the animals studied, at the very least, are representing the actions of others. If this is indeed a learning mechanism, to use Peterson's phrasing, the mirror neurons would allow for another organism to be an avatar for the animal to learn through. So yeah, I don't think we're exceptionally brilliant in this regard. Peterson's example for the avatar is a boy talking to his older sister about climbing on the roof of the house. And the sister points out the possible negative consequences of doing this, and the boy can then use his avatar to go through those different scenarios his sister described and decide if he wants to go through with it or not. Peterson, as the knower of what's in your head, is back.
People think they think, but it's not true. It's mostly self-criticism that passes for thinking. True thinking is rare, just like true listening. Thinking is listening to yourself. It's difficult. To think, you have to be at least two people at the same time. Then you have to let those people disagree. Thinking is an internal dialogue between two or more different views of the world.
It's a relatively subtle redefinition of a word compared to what we've seen in this book so far, but it's still a redefinition of thinking nonetheless. In this definition, every thought requires some form of conversation, either with yourself or others. Some areas of cognitive, this could make sense, like problem solving. As you're testing different solutions in your head, it might feel like there's a back and forth happening. But other areas, it makes less sense. Object and face recognition requires a self-chat. Object recognition is a very fast, non-dialogue dependent process. Learning new information you don't even realize you're learning necessitates an internal discussion. Whole lot of nope there. I'm gonna go with nah, dog. Broad oversimplification. But, continuing on with this thought,
you can't set straw men against one another when you're thinking either, because then you're not thinking. You're rationalizing, post hoc. You're matching what you want against a weak opponent so that you don't have to change your mind. You're propagandizing. You're using doublespeak. You're using your conclusions to justify your proofs. You're hiding from the truth.
On the one hand, Peterson has linked the current stuff to other things previously talked about in the book, so yay there. But oh, these links. We're a couple steps away from nihilism cookies again, with the doublespeak and propaganda and whatnot. When you're setting up a devil's advocate scenario in your head, I will agree that it's a good idea not to hobble the opposition. However, accurately representing the opposite view can be hard, but the reader is not provided any help on how to go about doing this, other than a warning to not strawman. An idea hidden in this is that everything warrants debate, and some topics should be debated. Thinking about changing jobs to international policy should have the different options considered. But for some topics, like should I jump off this cliff to climate change, opening it up for debate legitimizes the opposite side. There's a reason why play out the scenario of you jumping off this cliff isn't a normal part of treatment. Peterson then ties this thinking stuff into how it relates to active listening.
True thinking is complex and demanding. It requires you to be articulate speaker and careful, judicious listener at the same time. It involves conflict, so you have to tolerate conflict. Conflict involves negotiation and compromise. So, you have to learn to give and take and to modify your premises and adjust your thoughts, even your perceptions of the world.
I can't read that first sentence and not hear it in a smug, gatekeeping kind of tone. Like a hipster for real thinking. You thought you were thinking, but you really weren't. I've been actually thinking longer than you ever even thought to try. My script editor would like to add that Peterson has a tendency to sound persuasive with big word salads, but upon further inspection, the statements are hollow, as the description for thinking is sounding like it's going here. Modify perceptions, huh? Rule 2 had a lot about perception and the fundamental category being male versus female.
Stop using my words against me!
Being able to tolerate conflict and knowing how to negotiate fairly are good skills to have, so point to Peterson. I just agreed with Peterson, so you know what that means. Sharp turn into what the fuck Phil.
Sometimes conflict results in the defeat and elimination of one or more internal avatar. They don't like to be defeated or eliminated either. They're hard to build. They're valuable. They're alive. They like to stay alive. You better listen to them. If you don't, they'll go underground and turn into devils and torture you. In consequence, thinking is emotionally painful as well as physiologically demanding, more so than anything else, except not thinking.
I had thought these avatars were metaphors, but the language here is tripping Jung flags for me. Dividing them out from you, giving them a form of sentience that can turn malevolent, is reminding me of archetypes. I'd be surprised if these were a version of archetypes, but I really just can't shake this vibe I'm getting from them. Also, the avatar metaphor begins to lose some internal consistency here. We were instructed to set up avatars against each other in conflict in order to think the best, and we needed to make sure that both sides were strong. But one side is likely to emerge victorious, leaving the other defeated. If an idea or argument or trait or whatever is bad, shouldn't we discard it? But he's saying here that the defeated ones can go rogue and torture us, so we need to listen to those defeated avatars? Huh? Gonna need a citation on thinking being emotionally painful or extremely physiologically demanding. Although reading this book can hurt my brain, so he's not entirely wrong, just not how he intended.
But you have to be very articulate and sophisticated to have all of this occur inside your own head. What are you to do then if you aren't very good at thinking, at being two people at one time? That's easy. You talk, but you need someone to listen. A listening person is your collaborator and your opponent.
Ah, so if you're fancy pants smarty smarts, you can think internally, but if you're not fancy pants, you have to think externally. I don't like the framing on this distinction. To me, sometimes whatever I'm working through can benefit from an outside perspective. I don't know how many times I've been writing one of these Peterson scripts and I get stuck on how I want to say something or where an argument's trying to go, and so I bounce it off my husband. And at least half the time, I say whatever the thing is, and before my husband has a chance to say anything, I thank him for his time because I figured it out. I apparently just needed to verbalize it to understand what I was trying to get at. And it's almost like that adage about teaching and learning, where if you really want to learn something, you try to teach somebody else how to do it. But of course, in Peterson land, if you're having to externalize part of your thinking process, it's because you weren't sophisticated enough to do it on your own.
A listening person tests your talking and your thinking without having to say anything.
The rest of the paragraph is a bit disconnected from this thought, so let's stop here for a second. This reads like those nonsensical tweets from Jaden Smith. If Peterson said something about how this testing could be done sans verbal communication, I might have less need for clarification. Maybe. But as it stands, how does this listening person do this? Anyways, continuing on with these powerful listeners.
A listening person is a representative of common humanity. He stands for the crowd. Now, the crowd is by no means always right, but it's commonly right. It's typically right. If you say something that takes everyone aback, therefore, you should reconsider what you said. I say that knowing full well that controversial opinions are sometimes correct. Sometimes so much so that the crowds will perish if it refuses to listen. It is for this reason, among others, that the individual is morally obliged to stand up and tell the truth of his or her own experience. But something new and radical is still almost always wrong.
Taking a time out here, he's assuming a pretty homogeneous crowd for one person to represent the whole crowd. And in fairness, this can happen, but it takes a special group for it to be that homogeneous that one person would truly represent that crowd. The example I can think of, somewhat biased due to having watched a documentary recently, are the Hutterites. They're a closed Christian group that really puts the commune in community. In the documentary, unless they were interviewing someone who was a flight risk, the answers were pretty predictable.
I like the status quo. I like the system, the Hutterite system. I see absolutely no problem with my little girl growing up as a housewife.
So in a group like this, a random pick would probably represent the rest of the crowd. But that is a very close group with a strong ideology guiding all of their actions. That said, if this ill-defined group has a negative reaction to something you said, it would probably be in your best interest to have some introspection time on what happened. Have a think, figure out if you stand behind what you said, and maybe the group was wrong in some way. Or maybe what you said wasn't the best, and the group was at least partially right. I'm curious as to what he means by the crowd perishing for not listening to a controversial opinion. Is this a callback to his discussion of the unnamed biblical prophets who were ignored to the detriment of the Jews in those stories? Or is this something else? Finally, this last part would be funny if it wasn't so sad. Telling people to speak their truth in one line, but walking it back in the next if your truth is something new or radical. Of course, there's the lived truths that seem to be implicitly or possibly explicitly excluded from the valid truths. Any sort of sexual or gender identity that deviates from traditionally accepted ones. Continuing on.
You need good, even great, reasons to ignore or defy general public opinion. That's your culture. It's a mighty oak. You perch on one of its branches. If the branch breaks, it's a long way down, farther perhaps than you think. If you're reading this book, there's a strong probability that you're a privileged person. You can read. You have time to read. You're perched high in the clouds. It took untold generations to get you where you are. A little gratitude might be in order.
Pausing this paragraph again. Peterson has repeatedly emphasized the importance of tradition and culture. He's even sometimes allowed for that culture to be modified, where necessary, to update it for the present day. But other than referencing that you need good reasons to ignore or modify that culture, he doesn't specify what those good reasons actually are. It seems like that would be critical info to include when instructing others not to go fiddling with their society. But who knows, maybe that's the point. You can't even begin to understand the good reasons, so don't even try it. Of course, we're returning to the symbolism of us falling should we ignore or defy our culture. We are fallen creatures in a corrupt world, after all. I was a little shocked to see him use the word privilege earnestly. He's been so against this idea of the patriarchy that I would think a word like privilege would be tainted for him. Way back in Rule 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back, There was an implication that by reading this book, you were marking yourself as low in the dominance hierarchy of life. Life could be so much better for you if you had some self-respect. But now, the reader is perched high in the clouds because they have time to read. I'm not disagreeing that having the time and ability to read is a relative luxury. It just seems that the readers of this book might not be so far down the hierarchy after all. I also won't disagree that it's good to have some gratitude for our general quality of life in society. Things could certainly be a lot worse, at the very least. But I can be gracious for what I have and also work to improve things at the same time even. These two don't have to be mutually exclusive. Although his choice for culture being a metaphorical tree does have some implications. If you go around messing with the roots of that tree, you could well kill it, so just best leave those alone.
If you're going to insist on bending the world to your way, you better have your reasons. If you're going to stand your ground, you better have your reasons. You better have thought them through. You might otherwise be in for a very hard landing. You should do what other people do, unless you have a very good reason not to. If you're in a rut, at least you know that other people have traveled that path. Out of the rut is too often off the road, and in the desert that awaits off the road, there are highwaymen and monsters. So speaks wisdom.
One would think a smart highwayman or monster wouldn't be waiting terribly far from the road, as most of the prey would be on the road. Again, this idea that you better have good reasons for wanting to rock the boat, but no specification on what would qualify as a good reason. Do as the others do. Go with the flow. Conform. Obey. Only Peterson would try to sell a rut as a positive thing, although it would be well into ordered territory, so I imagine it would be comforting for him. And, of course, if you get out of the ordered rut, the chaos monsters will get ya. For this whole part, I think it's safe to summarize as the group or the culture is usually right, except for the rare once-in-a-blue-moon occasion it isn't. And this might be personal bias coming into play here, but I think it's kind of an oddity that any psychologist would essentially be encouraging groupthink. Groupthink occurs when the group dynamics suppress dissent or opposing viewpoints in the decision-making process. And this is typically seen as a negative thing as it can lead to bad decisions going unquestioned, which in extreme cases can lead to a loss of life. Janice looked at events like the Bay of Pigs invasion or the Vietnam War for the decision-making process that went on there that led to the undesirable outcomes. From this, he pulled together 8 symptoms of groupthink. The first 2 involve the group having lost realistic awareness of their power or moral standing. The group feels invulnerable or untouchable. The decisions made by the group are assumed to be morally right. The second cluster of symptoms involve a closed-mindedness of group members. If a question is raised about a decision, instead of trying to address the question, the group goes on the defensive and justifies the decision. Instead of having a realistic or informed assessment of what the group is going up against, there's a general assumption that the enemy is stupid or weak, or that the problem is an easy one. The final symptom grouping includes various pressures towards group uniformity. Group members who go against the majority will of the group are mocked or personally attacked until they fall in line. Or people can keep their dissenting opinions to themselves, either because they don't want to face the conformity pressures, or because they don't want to go against the group's apparent consensus. Because the majority of what's communicated is in line with the group's apparent will, it appears that the group is in agreement. However, this can be because of group members not feeling able to offer their actual thoughts. To keep the group's opinion on track, some group members may block conflicting information from being brought into the decision-making process. Altogether, these different factors and forces culminate in the group essentially locking themselves in an echo chamber and potentially making really bad decisions. Another example of this is the Challenger explosion, where the engineers involved gave the go-ahead to launch when they probably shouldn't have, but the factors we talked about led them to making this decision and resulted in a loss of life. Janice also made recommendations on how to avoid groupthink situations. They are to try not to let group members endorse any position when considering opinions. Consider alternate outcomes or scenarios. Basically, play devil's advocate against the decision. At points in the decision-making process, break the group into smaller groups, turn them loose, then re-adjourn. Compare progress. Rinse, repeat. In addition to the group members, bring in non-group people, especially if they have expertise on whatever thing is being worked on. Before rolling out the decision, have a second chance meeting for group members to express any lingering doubts, concerns, or questions. Peterson's repeated emphasis on tradition and culture being the wisdom warehouses seems to set up a groupthink situation for the readers pretty easily. Our ancestors were so much wiser than we are. If we follow their lead, life will improve. Culture and tradition are moral, period. Rule 2 could be seen as a lot of rationalization for why Peterson only allows for 2 genders. This book has included a fair bit of talk about the social justice warriors, atheists, or people who are just not going with how shit's always been done, as being ill-informed and not really understanding how the world or themselves work. When talking about most people who haven't lived life as Peterson deems appropriate, there seems to be an air of derision about it. Peterson's forceful, "this is how to live your life" tone would make it hard for people in Peterson spaces to speak against the lobster daddy. If you are in a Peterson space, it can seem like they are the last bastions of rational, ordered civilization, fighting the good fight against the chaos warriors trying to tear everything down. I know that some of my videos, in addition to other lefty YouTubers, have been shared to the Peterson subreddit. Speaking for my videos, the comments on the Reddit post or the video itself indicate those viewers cannot get past me. Purple hair means my dad didn't love me somehow. I've got crazy eyes. This grad student doesn't know anything. My Peterson impression, and my cheeky attitude towards the book, especially in the pre-roll. It's almost like they're finding reasons not to risk engaging with my actual arguments. Not following the book's advice. Naughty little lobsters. So we're left with think for yourself as long as it's an appropriate time and you don't go messing with tradition or culture too much, instead of think for yourself, question authority. Okay, that's enough Peterson for today. So if you were edutained, how about leaving a like? Maybe a comment? Ooh, how about subscribing? Yes. You can also find me on Twitter, my Discord, or my Patreon. Links for those are in the description box. And one year channel birthday thing, if you're interested in the little thing I'm doing that I'm pointing to off screen, hit up my Patreon for more info. And yeah, see you guys in the next one. Bye!